Welcome to EWTN Live. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa, and this is a show we bring you guests from all over the place. And today we have a guest that's going to be kind of special for a couple of reasons, including his connection here to EWTN. I'd like to just launch into that right away. I'd like to introduce our guest, who's Dr. Charles Rice from Notre Dame University. And he's here with us and has something really cool to talk about. So please welcome Dr. Charles Rice. Charlie, how are you? First of all, where are you hailing us from? Where are you coming from?
From Notre Dame.
Notre
Indiana.
Dame, yeah, all right. So good. You enjoy teaching there?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good place.
Now let me tell you why I'm here, all right?
Well, just want to make sure so the folks understand. Do you have any kind of inkling of an idea of how Notre Dame football is going to go?
We're on the way back.
You're on the way back.
Relax, no problem.
Okay, so I should relax, but I'm not going to worry about it.
The coach is named Charlie Weiss, all right? And it's very easy for me to get reservations in South Bend. I just slur the name a little bit.
Weiss, right.
He is a Notre Dame alumnus, and he was the offensive coordinator
so
with
like
the
Weiss
Patriots.
On Rice.
Oh, yes, and it's count on it. As I said before, God doesn't care who wins a football game, but his mother does.
All right, so we'll keep that very much in mind.
Right.
Now we've got the key issues out of the way from Notre Dame. What are you doing here?
Actually, I'm at Notre Dame. I'm emeritus at Notre Dame. E means out of it. Emeritus means deservedly. Right? And I'm also I teach at Notre Dame in the spring. I teach the morality and law course, and I also teach at Ave Maria School of Law in Ann Arbor in the fall, the jurisprudence and constitutional law. And I'm here to do a 13-part series on the natural law.
Okay.
Right? And let me say two things. We've been doing this for the past 2 days, and the production staff was absolutely outstanding. I mean, it was really, really great. They were very friendly and really efficient. And then I got to tell you very briefly about the Dolphins.
The Dolphins?
The Dolphins. You know, in the studio, in the backdrop, there's a big screen, all right? And I had nothing to do with this, but when I came in, I see this thing operating, and across the screen, there's moving a series of images, right? There's a street scene, there's a waving field of wheat, there's a shot of the earth from a space ship or whatever, and the dolphins that are swimming in the water.
Yeah.
And there's the U.S. Capitol with the the American flag and all that. There's a cattle drive, and all this stuff is moving across the screen. You know, and I walk in here, I say, "What is this?" You know, and you know, it grew on me. It really did. I really got to like it. I really got to like the thing, and I wanted to name the dolphins.
You wanted to name them?
I wanted to name them.
You know, they're only pictures.
I wanted to name them. No. Relax. I wanted to name them, and I couldn't think of any names. So at the beginning of the 9th session, I announced a worldwide Name the Dolphins contest, which is going to be, as soon as this show airs, anybody can enter. You can enter as many times as you want. You have to see the show, and the top 5 entries will get a Miami Dolphins hat, one size fits all, which I will provide. And I've already appointed an unbiased panel of judges. I can't give you their names because the pressure would be so great.
You know, we used to do that in Chicago.
So much at stake.
We used to do it in Chicago. We didn't name the judges. We always assumed that they were unbiased. Yeah.
No, it was great. I mean, it's really it was a great experience to do it. And I got to emphasize again that the people here at EWTN are just absolutely outstanding, and they did they did an entire series in 2 days.
Yeah,
13 programs in 2 days, which was amazing. I understand you did 13 in 1 day.
Yeah, there were 13 shows in 1 day. I still think I hold the record. Alice von Hildebrand is second.
But you're a Jesuit from Chicago. You're supposed to be good.
Yeah, at least fast talking. Now, with this series, what topics are you covering?
It's basically, the jurisprudence course that I've taught for 100 years at Notre Dame, which I now teach at Ave Maria also, compressed into 13 sessions. It's a natural law course, which involves a comparison of the natural law with the current philosophies that are operating.
All right.
And the natural law is really just a rule of reason built into us by our manufacturer. Everything has a nature, and a car has a nature built into it by General Motors. And in order to be free to drive the car, you have to act in accord with its nature. You can't feed it sand in the gas tank. You'll be pro-choice, but you're also going to be a pedestrian, because the natural law is simply a story of how things work. And in the contemporary culture, there's a rejection of the very idea that you can know objective truth. What Pope Benedict XVI called the dictatorship of relativism.
Yeah.
And that's what this course is about.
Now, you take on what some of these different philosophies are, right? You sort of try to analyze them. Let's just deal with one question, if we could. Why do you think there are movements of thought that are afraid to say something is objectively true? Because this is permeating the news, it permeates a lot of sitcoms, it permeates drama, it permeates the way our media works, as well as other parts of life. Why are people afraid to say that there is objective truth and we can know something about it?
Well, it goes back centuries. It goes back to the 14th century, actually, with William of Ockham and all this business, and Descartes, and he died in 1650, and he's a guy who, he's not a graduate of Notre Dame Law School. He's the guy who set out to find out what he could really know, and he ended up saying that the only thing I can know is my own idea. But I can't really know the essence of that camera over there, see? And his definition of an idea is that an idea is that which we know. Now, Thomas Aquinas, who has been, really adopted by the church in a sense, and they integrate Thomas into the teaching of Christ. And Thomas Aquinas said, on the contrary, that an idea is that by which we know. See, the idea is that by which I know that camera. I know what that camera is. See? And I know it through my senses that present the image of that to my active intellect, and my passive intellect then forms the idea. And then I make a judgment, see? And the second act of the intellect is the judgment. And that is where you say something is or isn't. So if I look at that camera and I say, that is a camera, now we can talk truth or falsity, you see? Because I know the essence of a camera, and so do you. So if I say that's a camera, you know that's true, because you know what a camera is, all right? If I look at that and I say that's a locomotive, that's false, because you know what a locomotive is and you know what a camera is, and you know that's not a locomotive. But if the only thing you can know are your own ideas, then hey, if that's a locomotive for me, okay, who are you to say it's not? Now you apply that what's happened is you apply that kind of thing to the moral area. As Thomas said, the same act cannot be both morally right and wrong. It's the principle of contradiction. See, that being can't be non-being. A thing can't be and not be at the same time under the same aspect. And so this is the basic thing. This is what Pope Benedict XVI referred to as the dictatorship of relativism.
Whereas, and just again, so the folks get a better understanding of this, because a lot of people don't study philosophy,
right? And
they don't know much about René Descartes. They might know a little bit about Descartes from the geometry that we studied in high school, Cartesian geometry maybe, but we don't study his philosophy. And I don't think people appreciate that little ideas that come from somebody in 1650 have a big impact in the way we talk about politics and voting and everything else that we do and making law. Is it legal to do this or illegal? Why? So let's just make sure that we really get that.
Yeah, the significance there is that relativism leads to legal positivism. And legal positivism is just a fancy term for the idea that since nobody can know what is right or wrong and what is just, therefore you can't criticize a law as being unjust. Hans Kelsen, who was the leading legal positivist of the 20th century, said, quote, justice is an irrational ideal. And he said you can't know what is right or wrong or just or unjust. Therefore, whatever law is enacted pursuant to the prescribed process is a valid law. And he was an honest guy, and he was honest enough. After the Second World War, he wrote and he said, Auschwitz and the whole Nazi regime was valid law. We don't like it, but it was valid law. On the contrary, you see, Thomas and the Catholic tradition, and the whole common law, the whole, Blackstone, the whole business, the whole Judeo-Christian tradition says, hey, there's a higher law. And there's a higher law that judges the human law. As Christ said to Pilate, you would have no authority over me were it not given to you from above. And that's the correct approach. And so we're in a position where, we're in a culture which is dominated by the Enlightenment ideas, which are basically secularism. There's no God, or if there is, he's not knowable. Relativism, and then individualism. Which means that you're an isolated, autonomous individual, and you make your own rules.
And nobody can tell me what I do, because, again, these ideas are all very connected. If all I can know are my ideas, then, and I don't know the thing in itself, I just know my idea about it. Therefore, I decide what my ideas are.
That's it.
You decide what your ideas are, and I can't tell you what your ideas are. You can't tell me what mine are.
That's it. And the Pope Benedict XVI, as Cardinal Ratzinger, addressed this in his writings. And he talked about crises in law. And one of the crises in law, he said, was consensus. It was the idea that nobody knows what's right or wrong, and it leads to legal positivism. And the other thing he pointed to in his writings in this area was the influence of the social contract, where the notion of the human person, which goes back to Aristotle and Augustine Thomas, is that the human person is social by nature. And the social contract theorists, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau especially, postulated that there was this mythical state of nature when everybody was just milling around, and they were all autonomous, isolated individuals, and they got together to form the state. And with Hobbes, they did it because they were killing each other, and they gave to the Leviathan, the state, full power, except over your own life, incidentally, and oddly enough, over your right not to incriminate yourself. I mean, you didn't give up that right.
So Thomas Hobbes is one philosopher,
an
Englishman who had a certain amount of influence, because he says the only reason the state exists is to protect us from each other, because we all want to kill each other.
Right. And then then you had John Locke, who was a very much more friendly view of the state of nature, and he said the problem with the state of nature was that you needed a common judge. So people got together and formed the state. What was the purpose? To protect rights. But he was the majoritarian, and
which means
that the definition of rights, and he said you have a right to overthrow the state if it doesn't, the government if it doesn't protect rights, but it's all up to the majority. He said when you join the social compact, you agree that the majority conclude the rest. You see, what's happening here is what Cardinal Ratzinger pointed to: consensus. The morality is determined by consensus. And the other guy was Rousseau. And Rousseau said, hey, the purpose of the state of nature, or purpose of the state, is to try to bring us back to the freedom of the state of nature. He said, you'll be forced to be free. And he said there should be nothing between the individual and the state. And you can see this today. In his essay on the government of Poland, he said that the first thing the child should see when he opens, the infant should see when he opens his eyes, is not the face of his father, but the face of the state. And he should see nothing else after that. There should be no intermediate associations between the individual and the state. The family is really kind of incidental. See,
which
so
is
all
something
this
that he lived out, by
together.
the way.
Yeah.
He wasn't.
I mean, there's nothing new, and these ideas have consequences.
Well, let's take a look at some of these consequences. You look at United States law.
Right.
One example that in the majority agreed with the Supreme Court decision in 1895, saying that it's legal to discriminate against people of color.
Right.
So you can segregate people on the basis of color. And since the majority agreed with it, then this is okay law by these theories.
Right.
But then we look back on that and as a shameful period of our history because it does something else. God is the one who gives dignity according to our Christian belief.
That's true.
And to take, even if the majority says you can take away the rights of people because of the color of their skin, God doesn't say that it's acceptable, and so we're going to fight against it.
Right. Now, the thing is that, things like Roe versus Wade and so on, you don't have to go to the natural law to attack that because the natural law is incorporated to a great extent in the Constitution. Roe versus Wade was contrary to the Constitution. But suppose you had a constitutional amendment, right, which, instituted slavery or whatever. Let's take that. Suppose they repealed the 13th Amendment and reinstituted slavery. And then you had a fugitive slave law which said that if you capture an escaped slave, you got to bring him back to his master, right? Now, if you're a judge, should you enforce that? See, now you're into the higher law question, see? Right. And the sad thing is that in the period before the Civil War, you had the fugitive slave law operating, and there was never a single judge who refused to enforce it. And on the contrary, Thomas tells you...
So folks understand that. That means that every time a slave ran away, and this was brought before a judge, the judge always said, give this slave back.
Some of them, yes, correct. There's none of them that stood up and said, I absolutely refuse to enforce it.
Because it's wrong. They wouldn't say it was wrong.
There were some, you have to give them credit, there were some who threw sand in the gears and in various means prevented the return of the slave. Right. But the issue is whether a human law can be made void by the higher law. All right, and we can get into that in terms of what Thomas said. I think it'd be good to do that.
Sure.
But let me give you one example. All right, during World War II, the Nazis had a program where they were doing experiments on prisoners in the concentration camps, and they were, utilitarian experiments. They were, they're good in utilitarian terms. They're trying, for example, to develop an anticoagulant.
Something to stop the blood from clotting.
A soldier is wounded and so on. So they would inject an inmate with the anticoagulant they were testing and cut off a limb and measure how long it took him to die. That's how they did it. Or they were testing flight gear to keep aviators from freezing to death in the North Sea if they crashed. So they would put an inmate in the suit and with electrodes and put him in freezing water and measure how long it took him to die. And these doctors were tried after the Second World War in the West German courts. And the courts convicted them. The defense was, hey, this was authorized by the law. And the West German courts said, when the enacted law conflicts with justice and the natural law, it has to give way. And that was very important.
As opposed to this other American jurist that you're talking about, Kelsen?
Kelsen was Austrian.
Kelsen, Austrian, who says that justice doesn't exist.
That's right.
Except as a myth. So you can't really criticize the Nazis.
Right.
Or the Supreme Court that said that slavery was, or segregation was morally acceptable,
Sure.
because there's no such thing as real justice. And this is a conflict in society then.
Oh, yeah.
Is there justice according to a law that God put in us, or is it, again, just my idea and your idea, and we can't resolve it on the basis of
let me just mention how that plays out in Roe versus Wade. There was a New York court, a New York case in 1972, the Byrne case, B-Y-R-N, where New York had a very liberal abortion law. And the court, the highest court of New York, said two things. They said, first of all, the unborn child is a human being from conception, number one. Then they said it is up to the legislature to decide which human beings are persons. So you have legal rights not because you're a human being, but because you're a person. And in any just system, every human being is entitled to be treated as a person.
Because the natural law says justice requires you to treat every human being
as a person.
As a person.
And the New York court said, whatever the legislature decides, and they cited Hans Kelsen for that, by the way. The Supreme Court then didn't take that case, but in Roe versus Wade, they said essentially the same thing. Because in Roe versus Wade, they said, whether or not this is a human being, and we're not going to decide that, this is a non-person. So that's the same as if an acknowledged human being was said to be a non-person. And then what they did in Roe was they withdrew the protections of the homicide law from the unborn child. See, now, I don't want to filibuster, but let me just make this point. We're beyond that. Because in the Shivo case, what you had was an example where the court there was not simply authorizing the killing of Terry Shivo, which is what they do in abortion cases. They authorize the killing of the unborn child by the private person. In the Shivo case, Judge Greer actually ordered the removal of the nutrition and hydration. Michael Shivo had asked for an order removing the feeding tube, and the first order said, you are authorized to remove the feeding tube. See, that's kind of like the abortion orders, all right? And then the second order said, you're mandated to remove the tube. And the final order said you are mandated to remove nutrition and hydration. So presumably, even if she were able to take food by mouth,
they couldn't give her any water or anything.
So this is a case of the state actually decreeing death, and why that happens.
And decreeing death, because they do that in the case of criminals convicted of capital crimes. But in this case,
totally innocent
somebody who is completely innocent of any crime.
Right. See, and what we're talking about here is a situation where in 1986, since 1986, it's been recognized that a competent adult can starve himself to death, all right, if he wants. And incompetent, the decision as to whether to remove food and water is going to depend on what that person would have intended, all right? In some states, it's going to depend on what his best interests would be. But the decision is going to be made by the healthcare agent, caregiver, family, etc. And where they don't agree, or where they don't disagree, where they're all in agreement to remove the feeding tube, which, as John Paul pointed out in 2004, where there's no reason to do it, it's euthanasia. Right. Where they're all in agreement, you never hear about it. See? The only reason you heard about the Shivo case was because the family disagreed. And then the court stepped in and mandated the execution of Terry Shivo. So the root problem is that we have put into our law a regime where family members can look at a patient who is not dying, who is not in pain, who is sustained by feeding, which is not burdensome or painful, and family members can get together and say, we think that patient would rather be dead, and it's over. right? And that's the problem. And this is part of the entire utilitarian and secular thing. I mean, there's no...
But see, now this is where, again, so we keep focused on this discussion, that the idea that comes from philosophy, namely, I don't know the thing in itself. All I know is my idea about it, and all you know is your idea about it.
Right.
And all you know is your idea of my idea.
That's correct.
We don't know the truth.
That's right.
You know, and so if you have that position, your claim that there is a real justice
it's just my idea.
It's just your idea.
Yeah, that's right.
And you can't impose it. As a matter of fact, one of the things that they're concerned about is you are trying to impose what the church tells you, not seeing this as, because they don't recognize any kind of a natural law. And so therefore the church is trying to take control of the government.
Right.
And therefore it's just a power play in their mentality.
You got it.
And we have to then say, wait a minute, there's something else that we have to look at here.
Yeah, and you know what else is involved here? It's the idea that nobody can know anything about God, that any statements about God are non-rational, and therefore they don't belong in the public arena. Therefore you can't speak about religion. Therefore, you can't affirm the existence of God because that's a non-rational statement. That's why we're getting into all these law cases. That's why we're dividing ourselves into happy holidays and Merry Christmas people. You know,
right. Again, as I just heard, one newscaster, Aaron Brown, who was speaking to a group of college students, and he was complaining how another network, not his, was talking about the problem. What's this problem of making it illegal to keep Christ out of Christmas? You know, why are they talking about putting Christ back into Christmas? Who in hell cares? Was his comment. And to my first reaction to that was, well, actually, Mr. Brown, in hell they don't care. In hell, they're in perfect agreement with you.
That's right.
And they don't want Christ in Christmas. But, you know, this is part of the same mentality.
It is.
You know, and so this is then the question that we have to ask, what do we do? How do we as citizens respond to this in the next 3 minutes?
Listen, this is a great time of the year. It really is, because they have nothing. You know, John Paul said these other culture-forming forces are exhausted. He told Father Hardin back in the early 90s, he said the 21st century is going to see the greatest renaissance of Christianity in history. We may have to go through hell to get there, but I think he's right. And the reason is because they have nothing. And the basic idea of secularism. You know, we as Catholics, we get an inferiority complex, and we tend to think that the smart guys are all the atheists and agnostics.
Because this idea sounds so radical, and therefore they must be smart.
They must be smart guys, we tend to think, well, our faith is just blind, irrational, leap in the dark kind of thing. And John Paul in Fides et Ratio has shown that faith and reason are two wings that come together. And the thing that we've got to remember is that basically their position makes no sense. I mean, it is not only reasonable to believe in God, it is absolutely unreasonable not to believe in God. In 30 seconds, let me tell you why. All right? There's a principle that's self-evident, the principle of sufficient reason. You know that everything has a reason, right? Every effect has a cause. It can't be its own cause, because then it would pre-exist itself. Now, the question you got to ask yourself, the existence of God is not self-evident, but you think about this. What are we talking about with God? We're talking about an eternal being. How do you know there always had to be an eternal being? It's the question raised by John Paul. Why is there something rather than nothing? Now, I want you to think about this during the break, all right? How do we know there always had to be an eternal being? Because imagine that there was a time when there was absolutely nothing. Then you know that there could never be anything, right? And my philosophical authority for that is Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music. All right? So
great source.
That's true.
Yeah.
But it's true.
Yeah.
It makes no sense not to believe in God.
Yeah.
And we are on the winning side. We really are.
And so one of the things that we need to do then is take a re-examination of what this natural law is.
Right.
Take a look at our thinkers who have thought this through, who have posited what it means to believe in justice,
right,
and in reason, and in the objective truth, and then to go forward, not being afraid of these kind of movements in the culture, but take them on and then convince them of the truth of Revelation.
Right, and it would be a good idea to, look at the unjust law.
Yeah, and examine unjust laws on the basis of the justice that comes from the natural law built into us, just as had to be done in regard to race in this country, as had to be done with Hitler's Germany, the Empire of Japan and its mistreatment of the Chinese and others, and to do the same thing with the unborn, the sick, and the aged.
That's right.
All right.
Okay.
Well, that's easy. So, all right, to make that serious something that we're going to definitely want to see. But right now what we're going to do is take a short break. We're going to come back in a couple of minutes, and we want to get your comments and your calls. So for Dr. Rice on this issue and what we have to do to help bring about this, or be part of this renaissance of Christian culture and natural rights and natural law. So please stay with us.
Join us for the Daily Mass, celebrated each day here on EWTN.
Welcome back. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa on EWTN Live, and we are with Dr. Charles Rice. And we're talking about natural law, as well, especially as it affects our own laws. And before we get to some of our callers and other questions, one thing I just want to let people know that you have a couple of books available in our religious catalog, right?
You're talking about Gone with the Wind and War of Peace?
I don't think that's in our religious catalog, and we don't have that. So what do we have that you wrote by yourself?
Okay.
Well, somebody's got to teach them about copyright law. Go ahead.
50 questions on the natural law.
50 questions on that last one.
The sequel will be the answers. But 50 questions. There's another one, The Winning Side, which is questions on living the culture of life. And then my daughter Teresa and I are just finishing a book, which is kind of moral philosophy for high school, college, and upward people, called Where Did I Come From? Where am I going, and how do I get there?
Okay, good. Yeah. And that we'll have that your daughter next week.
Right, that's right.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
We have a caller. Hello? Is the caller there? Hello, you there?
Hello, this is Rick.
Oh, Rick, good. All right. And Rick, where are you from?
From Michigan.
Great, great. What part of Michigan?
The middle of the state, Bay City.
Oh, okay, good. Good. My brothers live down on the coast of Lake Michigan. What's your question?
Well, my question concerns the United States. Were the founders, who wrote the Declaration and the Constitution, and maybe even Thomas Jefferson, were these people that were strong believers in natural law?
Good question. There was a mixed current there. There was the Enlightenment current, and there was also the natural law, traditional natural law, common law current. Let me explain this by giving a case. In 1798, the Supreme Court in Calder against Bull decided that a Pennsylvania or state law was not an ex post facto law because it was a civil law rather than a criminal law. And the Constitution forbids ex post facto laws that are retroactive.
Well, and just so we understand that, if I'm drinking tea, and if they come up with a law, you can't drink tea, and then they say, okay, Pacwa, you're under arrest because you drank tea.
No, you're under arrest because you drank it last week.
Right, that's what I mean. You drank tea last week, so therefore that applies to you in the past.
Right, and the court decided that narrow question. It doesn't apply to civil laws. And then Chief Justice Chase said, if there were truly an ex post facto law, and even if the Constitution didn't forbid it, the natural law would render it void. And Justice Iredell, in his opinion, disagreed. And he said, you can't use natural law because, as he said, the best and purest minds have differed as to what it means. That's the Protestant view. He said, who knows what natural law is? Right? And that's the view that has predominated in this country. Mm-hmm. And there was also in the Constitution the Enlightenment currents and so on. But the interesting thing is that at that time, Iredell was the only member of the court that took that position. So it was a development later on where these Enlightenment ideas really became predominant.
And Supreme Court Justice Thomas, of the President of the Supreme Court, has been criticized because he's spoken favorably of natural law as a basic, So now he would be considered the minority on the Supreme Court of today. Right. While the opposite point of view was the minority.
Senator Biden criticized him because he had made comments favorable to natural law, and he criticized Judge Bork because he didn't agree with natural law.
Right.
All right. So.
Yeah, that's why some people have two sides to their mouth. Joe from Pennsylvania.
Yes, Father.
Hi. What's your question, sir?
Well, I'm cognizant of the fact that there's 5 main characteristics of a valid law.
All right.
One of those characteristics is that it must be for the common good. So I want to know if the civil liberty law, so-called civil liberty law, can it supersede a law for the common good?
So, what does he mean by? I
don't know.
What do you mean by civil liberty law?
Well, the ACLU tells people that they have certain civil liberties, and it seems to me that a lot of times they're incongruous with a valid law that exists for the common good of the people.
Okay. Yes. You know what you've put your finger on is the individualism that is prevalent as a result of the Enlightenment philosophy. And what we're seeing here is an atomization of the community where there's this exaltation of these newly defined individual rights.
That's what you mean by atomized, that you take it into each individual like a little atom separate from everybody else. Right. And has absolute priority for that particular
You ignore the common good. And the common good, as the Catechism points out, is a set of conditions under which people can most easily reach their fulfillment. It requires respect for the person, it requires social well-being and development, and it requires peace. And if you're an individualist, hey, I'm aboard, pull up the gangplank, I don't care about the common good.
Right. Yeah, the heck with everybody else.
Yeah.
All right, good. Yeah, so this individual law should not supersede.
It all depends on the case, but the ACLU is a destructive force in our legal system.
Mm-hmm. Because their approach is not to go by natural law at all, but what is for each individual alone.
They have been among the principal architects of the culture of death. The idea that they were very strongly favoring the execution of Terry Schiavo is indicative of where they are.
And I think, too, it's ironic that they also will fight against laws of notification of parents when minors, if the issue that they say is about freedom of choice, then to allow parents to have some influence on that and give other information is being stopped, which is contrary to their other principles.
Right.
Let's take a question from our studio audience. First of all, sir, where are you from?
I came up here from Auburn, Alabama.
Auburn, Alabama. Welcome. And
from New Mexico originally, though.
Great. And what's your question?
As a veterinarian, I sometimes deal with cases where there's been deliberate cruelty or neglect involved, causing great suffering and death.
And cruelty and neglect of animals.
Of animals.
Yeah. Okay.
Of the patients that will come in. And in discussing these with colleagues, sometimes it's come up that the way we rationalize dealing with those is that it's bad for the human being to behave that way because it ultimately corrodes and degrades their own moral character. I was wondering how the natural law would address this question and whether we can conclude that it's an inherently wrong thing to do.
That's
so just so folks understand, the question is, does natural law have any influence on how we think about cruelty to animals?
Yeah, that's a good question. Animals, cats, and dogs. I believe that you really want to think about it. Dogs are little people in fur coats, all right? But they're not really. I mean, the animal, that kind of animal has a material soul. That is, he's not an immortal being. But our duty to animals does not arise because of any rights of the animal. The animal is not a rights possessor because he's not a person. Our duty to the animal is a duty to God to treat his creation reasonably. And your answer is correct, that in refusing to do that, we injure ourselves, because every time we violate the natural law, we injure ourselves. We also injure the common good, because we deprive the community of the person we ought to be. But it's not because animals have rights. I mean, PETA and various other groups, Peter Singer thinks that animals have rights, right? And, he says, the duck is a person, probably, and you can't shoot the duck because the problem there, because you're not going to replace it with another happy duck, because ducks are presumably happy. And I mean, the whole thing is crazy.
Well, who is Peter Singer, by the way?
Peter Singer is the philosopher at Princeton University. By all accounts, a very, very nice guy and a very consistent guy in his position. But in his practical ethics, he said you have to divorce ethics from any talk of God or objective morality. And he said, who's a person? A person is a being with rationality and self-consciousness. So, a horse or a dog is a person, but a newborn infant is not, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Once you cut loose from the whole idea of nature, and that you can know what nature is, what human nature is, and once you cut loose from creation, because that's the source of rights, once you cut loose from that, all bets are off.
And again, when you say that you can't cut loose from the fact of creation, because that also implies there is a creator.
That's correct.
Who created with a plan, and that either you act in accord with what the creator expects, or you go against his expectations.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're talking about rights, I mean, what's the basis for asserting rights against the state? We're talking about the natural law and all that, but you have to talk about the lawgiver. Anytime you're talking about a law, you should say, well, whose law? And the basis for transcendent rights against the state is creation in the image and likeness of God, because every state that has ever existed or ever will exist has gone out of business or will go out of business. Every single human being who has ever been conceived will live forever. You see? That's the basis for absolute rights against the state. I mean, the person is above the state.
Exactly.
And you lose sight of that, it's all over.
Yeah, C.S. Lewis had put it so well that the state is mortal. The individual persons within the state are immortal.
That's exactly right. And Cardinal Ratzinger, as Cardinal now, Pope Benedict XVI, wrote about this extensively. And he said, in the struggle for life, talking about God is indispensable, because you can't talk about rights except in the context of creation.
All right, let's get another phone call. Hello?
Hello.
Hi, where are you from?
Hi, I'm Marie from Connecticut, Enfield, Connecticut.
Great, welcome. What's your question?
My question is, what is the church doing about the fact that people who are atheists seem to be able to move the law, to do whatever it is they wish to do, in terms of taking prayer out of the school? They took a huge cross down in San Diego because an atheist, a person who didn't believe in God, was offended by it. They seem to, when they set their mind to it, even in the hospital system, there's no, you're not allowed to mention God. And people, it's a time when people are ill, when they need God the most. What are we doing? I find that there are no supports in the church for people like myself who feel that they would like to become a part of being supportive of God in this country and fighting back a little bit. It seems that we're all just sort of sitting back and letting them take away the very mention of God. People in the town I grew up in can't even put a creche on public property, and or even outside their home. It's against the law now.
Outside their homes? That's amazing.
Could be, yeah.
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 So what should the church do?
Well, first of all, the church is not involved, in political activity. It shouldn't be in that sense. All right, that's true. But we're supposed to be. But the answer is not.
What do you mean by we?
We lay people.
Okay.
All right. We're supposed to be involved in that kind of thing. But the answer is not in politics. Did you ever hear the derivation of the word?
Politics?
Yeah.
Yeah. The Greek polis.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't want the Greek derivation.
Poly means many, and ticks are little blood-sucking creatures.
Oh, that's a different.
That's a different one.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
That's the classical definition. Right. But we're in a culture which is the result of 3 centuries of this Enlightenment business, and it's a culture which, as Bishop Daniel Jenke of Peoria said, is hostile to Christ. Yeah. Because it all comes down to the claim of Christ, which is a claim not just to be another idea that you can discuss and reject or accept or whatever, but a claim to dominion, a claim to your will, and a claim to your love. And this is something you either accept or reject, and this society rejects it. Mm-hmm. And so what we got to do is, I asked one young clerk a while ago, I said, okay, smart guy, how are we going to convert this country? He said, one by one. And what we got to do is speak the truth. I'm going to tell you a story. Cardinal Gagnon, the former head of the Council on the Family, recounted a conversation he had with John Paul. And he said, the Pope said to me, error makes its way because the truth is not taught. And he continued, quoting the Pope. This is practically a quote. He said, do not spend your time trying to rebut the errors of all those who are wrong. There are so many that would never end. He said, he's quoting the Pope, he said, instead speak the truth. Because when you speak the truth, a grace goes with it. And when that person needs that grace, it will be there. Mm. But if you don't speak the truth, no grace goes with it. Yeah. So we should do this, see?
And this is something that, especially when it comes to the political realm, this is especially the realm that the laity have to take the proper leadership, rather than the clergy.
And we got to speak the truth. We got to speak the truth, unvarnished truth. Yeah.
Let's take another question here from our studio. First of all, where are you from, sir?
Miami, Florida, Father.
Great. Welcome.
My question is, why is it in most churches, on any given Sunday, during the homily, when the priest is preaching, they never talk about the major moral issues or reinforce the position of the Catholic Church on things such as abortion, same-sex marriage, or euthanasia?
Dr. Weiss?
I have the same question.
Wait a minute.
Yeah, I can't give you an answer to that. I think you don't want priests at Mass giving political diatribes. Far from it, but you do want some teaching on the moral law and some teaching on these things that you mentioned. I can't give you an answer to that. I think it's a failing of the church in this country.
As someone who hears from a number of priests who have done that, they have spoken up, and they talk about how it divides the parish,
right?
And because there are members of our parishes who are in the pews and they don't accept the church's teaching. They might accept maybe more the idea of the Enlightenment that, well, I just know my ideas. I don't know the truth. I just have my ideas. You have your ideas, and you can't impose them on me from the pulpit. Right. And so that's one of the reactions that some of the priests get. And some priests don't say anything at all because they're concerned that the people will not like them for saying those things.
I can understand that, but there still is a prudential question of at least trying, and at least undertaking to try to bring people along.
Yeah.
And I'm not throwing rocks at any clergy or anything in particular, but I think we all have to come out of the bomb shelters here.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the truth. And the natural law is simply the truth of our nature. And I think we ought to start talking about it.
Good. We have another call already. Hello?
Hello?
Hi, where are you from?
From New Mexico.
Great.
Laura?
Great. And what's your question?
Yes, I heard in a class that I took that the term natural law actually had its origins with the Stoic philosophers. And if that is the case, first I was wondering if that was the case. And if it is the case, was that who St. Paul was referring to in Romans at the beginning, where he talks about the pagans who have the law of God written in their hearts?
Okay, good. So is this idea of natural law from the Stoic philosophy school, which is a Greek school philosophy, and is that where St. Paul got his ideas from?
No. I mean, there are different theories of natural law. I mean, what we're talking about in terms of natural law is one of the four kinds of law. And a law is simply, all law is, a rule of reason for the common good made by him who has care of the community and promulgated. And there are four kinds of law. There's the eternal law, which is God's concept of things. There's the divine law, which is what God has told us about himself, Old Testament, New Testament, and the tradition handed down by the apostles, all of which are committed to the teaching church for interpretation. Then there's the natural law, which is the imprint of the eternal law on the rational being. And the natural law is the rule of reason implanted in us by God at creation, by which we can know, through reason, how to act and what to do. Then the fourth kind of law is the human law. Now, in the interpretation of the natural law, you have these basic inclinations of human nature to seek the good, to preserve yourself, to preserve the species, to live in community, to know and to choose, and you make deductions from that. For example, you know theft is wrong, even apart from the commandment. The commandments are just specifications of the natural law. And so you know theft is wrong because it's contrary to community. What kind of a community would it be if it were open season on cars in the parking lot?
And even a very simple way, for someone to recognize natural law. How many like having their own things stolen? Who likes to be robbed?
Yeah, right. That's right.
Well, if you don't like to be robbed, then don't rob.
That's right.
Who likes being lied to? No, nobody does. So don't lie.
That's right. And now the point which differentiates this from a lot of other natural law conceptions is that you look at the lawgiver, and the lawgiver of the natural law is God. And Christ is God, and Christ has given us the teaching church as the authoritative interpreter of the natural law. The magisterium is a great gift because it is the authoritative interpreter of the natural law, and so we have a way of knowing, for example, in nutrition and hydration and that kind of thing. So it's light years removed from these pagan concepts of natural law. Those had part of the truth, but not the whole truth.
All right, good. We have one last question. We have just a short time left. What's your question, sir?
The thing that I'm concerned about is we're surrounded by so much stress. We have so much information that we all think that we're experts, and yet we end up just coming up with opinions and being real superficial. What impact is this having on us as a society? The fact that we all have an opinion, cling to it, and yet we refuse to investigate, to discern.
Well, I think that's true, especially if you get your opinion from the nightly news. I mean, there is a problem in that kind of thing, and I think what we have to do is to recognize that there are sources for us to know the truth. And in this area, the ultimate source is reason, but the magisterium also.
And I think in the last 30 seconds, just would want to say that brings up the issue that there's a certain humility that I have to say that my mind has to submit to this natural law because it's something greater than I am, and it's something worth submitting to. One other thing I have to submit to is that we're coming to the last 15 seconds.
Yeah, and if you want to drive your car, you better submit to the natural law of the car and not put sand in the gas tank.
All right. Well, let me give you my blessing. May God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Thank you, and God bless you.
Sunday Night Live with Father Benedict Groeschel. Father Benedict discusses friendship. What does it mean? Join him for his thoughtful insight and find out why friendship can play a central role in developing our faith. That's on the next Sunday Night Live.
Hi, this is Colin Donovan. Thanks for listening to the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
We're here with Bert Gezi, author of the book Voices of the Saints, and today we'll be talking about St. Pachomius, whose feast day is May the 9th. And as we pick up his story, Bert, he was a 4th century Roman soldier of all things.
Yes, converted by the example of Christians he witnessed in Egypt when he was on mission there. He became a hermit after he was converted and spent 7 years in training. He memorized a lot of scripture, and he felt directed by an angel in some kind of a dream or vision to found a community of monks and give them a rule of life. And so he's regarded as the founder of community monasticism in the Eastern world because of that rule he gave them. He organized his monks into houses of 30 who performed common work. Some made baskets, some did this, some did that. And they gathered together several times a day for prayer and for meals, so they had a real community life, and they supported themselves with their work. So they did prayer and work, which became the tradition of monasticism. Very practical teacher this man was. He taught people to think a lot about your death, because if you remind yourself of death, you're going to live a good holy life. Here's what he said. "O body, before we're separated, rise up boldly to worship the Lord without resistance. And if you listen to me, we shall enjoy happiness together, inheriting the blessing. But if you don't listen to me, then cursed am I that I've been chained to you. For on your account I, a wretched thing, shall be condemned. Now if you do this daily, and consecrate yourself, you shall become real temples of God. And since God dwells in you, the cunning and wiles of Satan shall not be able to abide in you." In his lifetime, he founded 9 monasteries for men and 3 for women, and had 3,000 disciples.
Wow.
His life message is really something about community. Community is something we all need if we're going to live a successful Christian life. We need brothers and sisters to support us and share our lives.
The life and example of St. Pachomius. His feast day is May 9th. And that's Bert Gezi, author of the book Voices of the Saints.
EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Dear Father Angelus.
Letters to EWTN.
Some of these questions are important ones and very practical in the application of what we should be doing as Christians. Like this one here, it asks, what are the last rites of the Church? And that rites is spelled R-I-T-E-S. It really consists of 3 sacraments and a very special blessing. The first sacrament to be administered for the last rites would be the sacrament of penance, the rite of reconciliation, when a person goes to confession. And if they are in the state of grave sin, that sin and all sins are taken away when they're sorry for them and they're confessed. And if anybody would ever forget the act of contrition, they don't have to be too concerned about that. I can teach you one here of just 3 words. My Jesus, mercy. Asking for the loving kindness of our God. The second sacrament is the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. And when it turns out to be the last time a person receives the Holy Eucharist, it's called Holy Viaticum, our food for our trip into eternity. The third sacrament is the sacrament of the anointing of the sick, when the priest takes the oil and anoints our foreheads and the palms of our hands. Often this sacrament brings great peace and relief to the person who receives it, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. And the last is the apostolic blessing, which has a very special plenary indulgence attached to it. Those are the rites of the Church.
Welcome to Does the Church Still Teach That? On the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. Here's your host, Father Shannon Collins.
Religious life. We've all seen, I think, nuns and brothers and religious priests. But what is religious life? Well, in a word, religious life is living out one's baptismal vows in a more extraordinary way, in a way which is not the ordinary path to holiness. We're all seeking holiness, but for a religious, he's going an extraordinary route. Right now we're in a parlor where some of the cloistered nuns will visit with family, with visitors to the monastery at times. But as you can see, there's going to be a grate. They belong to Christ. As religious women, cloistered women, they have vowed themselves to the cloister. And so therefore they are Christ's in soul and in body, living out their Christian life in a way which is out of the ordinary, extraordinary. Living out one's baptismal vows, we know that when we were baptized, we were washed away of all sins. Washed away of original sin, washed away of any actual sins if we were baptized later. The fact is, sometimes we fall again into sin. After baptism, after a new birth, sometimes we get wounded in the supernatural life. We who were made into a new creation sometimes die supernaturally. That is, we commit mortal sin, perhaps, or venial sins. And so our dear Lord knows these sorts of things, and so he gave us a sacrament called confession. Confession to forgive those sins committed after baptism. This is the topic for today's segment of Does the Church Still Teach That? The necessity of confession. Not just that it's a sacrament, but the necessity for Roman Catholics to use that sacrament of confession. There was a Southern Baptist who was heading towards the horse races, and of course he wasn't going to bet because he felt that gambling was not appropriate, but he just wanted to kind of see how things went, and he ended up spending a number of hours there, and all of a sudden he went back to the stalls to see some of the horses, and he saw a Catholic priest back there. The Catholic priest was blessing one of the horses. So the Protestant then went back to the stands and he saw the race, and the same horse that was blessed by that priest won. This happened again. He went back to the stalls. He saw that priest give a blessing again to a horse, went up to the stands, saw that horse win again. 2 for 2 the priest was. Then it happened a third time. And again, after a while, the Baptist friend started to follow this priest around. And eventually he saw the priest bless a 4th horse. And despite his principles, he went back to the betting window. And he emptied out his wallet and he put the whole thing down on that horse that was blessed by the priest. The race began. The horse blessed by the priest was doing real well, leading in the beginning, around the first turn, around the second turn, and into the final stretch, and all of a sudden, about 100 yards before the finish line, the horse pulls up, falls over, and dies. The Baptist was not happy, confronted the priest and said, "Listen, I saw you bless 3 horses, and all 3 horses won a race. Now, what happened with that 4th horse?" And the Catholic priest said, "Well, if you were Catholic, you'd understand the difference between blessings and last rites." Priests, they can do a lot of things. They can bring down Christ upon the altar bodily. But they can also be an instrument in absolving sins. An extraordinary thing, really, to be an instrument in an act where you bring a Christian from the state, perhaps, of serious sin to a state of new life. I'm going to read to you from the Gospel of St. John. This part of the gospel is just after our dear Lord rose from physical death. And having risen from physical death, he wanted to give the power to human instruments